Hi, I'm Zac Lindsey. I'm an anthropologist by training and a fiction writer for fun. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how you can use anthropology in fictional world building, but also we're going to talk about why you might want to do that. So I'm going to start by showing you some examples of a writer who could have used anthropology but did not, and then a writer from history who did use anthropology. We'll talk a little bit about what anthropology actually is. Then after that, I'll give you some examples of how you can use it, again, mostly in fantasy or science fiction, but it can also work for speculative fiction or other types of world building. So let's get started. Haren Ellison was known to be possibly a jerk. I didn't know him, so I don't want to say that for sure, but that's the general impression that I've gotten from reading about him. And sometimes his fans knew that he was a bit highly strung, so they asked him certain questions they knew that would send him into a chaotic fit. And one of those questions was, where do you get the jelly beans? And we actually consider this today the jelly bean problem. So unfortunately for Haren Ellison, he's very well remembered for this specific situation. In Repent, Harlequin Said the TikTok Man, the main character throws a massive amount of jelly beans all over the place, right? And the question is, of course, where did he get them at? Because Haren Ellison explains this dystopian society, but he never explains where you might come up with, a couple tens, hundreds of thousands of jelly beans. There are lots of solutions to this problem, but anthropology is actually one solution to this problem. And the answer is that he clearly got them at a jelly bean festival, right? We can have any explanation that we want. The Time Lord, the TikTok man, right? He always wants to show at the end of every year how many minutes you've saved for him or that sort of thing. So he gives you a symbolic amount of jelly beans. You don't have to explain that the main character stole the jelly beans, but just by having that scene in there, that will help the reader understand where he got the jelly beans from, right? And it adds kind of an interesting component to your world. It makes it seem a little bit more realistic. Again, though, Haren Ellison was known to be a bit of a jerk, so he usually just answered people by being angry at them. Another example we have is Ursula Lin, and her father was the anthropologist Alfred Kroeber. Anthropology played a huge influence on her world building in general. So we really see her world expand outward as the character sees their world expand outward. So Ged is, of course, a wizard, but what do wizards do, right? We learn about what wizard culture is like. Then we learn where they do it, and we also learn where they learn it at, right? Where they go to learn it, and we see the world expanding through the eyes of the character, and the world that we see is extremely rich with detail. Le Guin didn't copy-paste, right? And sometimes I hear people saying, oh, I'm going to do Greek-inspired or that sort of thing. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. We'll talk about that again in a little bit. But although Ged is a person of color, Earthsea is not Africa, and it's not like the Mediterranean or that sort of thing. I am here in beautiful Quintana Roo, Mexico, and there's a little bit of noise in the background, so sorry about that. I'm sure that Ursula Le Guin made errors in her world building, but no one has ever asked her, as far as I know, where the jelly beans in the story came from. So we can see that anthropology helped her create a more dynamic world. So you're probably asking at this point, but what the heck is anthropology? I'm sure you've heard the term. There's a lot of misinformation about what it is, a lot of old stereotypes about how the discipline was practiced in the 1920s. Some of those are unfortunately still true. A lot of them are not. And Ursula Le Guin was really, her father was on the forefront of the new wave in anthropology to make it a little bit less, to be frank, racist than it was when it first started. Anthropology has 4 fields today. We talk about cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology, biological anthropology, and archaeological anthropology. And you might be surprised to know that archaeology is actually considered a branch of anthropology. It is important that it's a branch of anthropology because anthropology at its heart is really the study of sort of learned behaviors of humans, how they behave in big groups together. So festivals, coming of age events, funerals, and private behaviors that are influenced by the broader society, like prayer. That falls under traditional cultural anthropology. But there are other branches of anthropology that also explore human behavior. So there's linguistic anthropology that studies the way that people perceive languages, how they perceive accents and dialects and that sort of thing. Then there's biological, which is the study of the body. It's usually the study of bones, but not always. There are biological anthropologists who do study live people. And it's probably the most famous or well, useful form of anthropology today, because it's part of forensic sciences. So it can, the people who practice biological anthropology can sometimes identify murder victims and that sort of thing. So it's a very important discipline today. Finally, there's archaeology, and that's all the stuff that I just said, but in the past. So again, we sometimes as archaeologists get stereotyped as collectors, and there certainly were a lot of bad things happening in archaeology in the past. Today, it is not really about collecting things, right? Today, it is a little bit more about understanding what those things were used for in the cultural sense that I mentioned before. When we look at a fantasy or science fiction culture, a lot of times we can break it down by the same elements that people use to study anthropology today, real cultures, right? And one of the main ways of doing that is what is called an ethnography. And what I'm here today to talk to you about is what I like to call the ethnography of our heroes. So ethnography is interviewing local sources to better understand their culture. The ethnography of the heroes, the idea is we're asking questions of our major characters that help us understand the worlds they live in better. So this centers your characters' perceptions of their worlds. That's one thing that's really important. And it avoids stereotypes, and it helps to avoid info dumps. Again, when we see Ged, we learn about the world as he does, and that is really important to our understanding of Earthsea. The audience sees what parts of the characters, what parts of the world's society are important to the characters. There are lots of questions you can ask when you're building an ethnography of your heroes. There's lots of characters you can ask. You can ask all your characters if you want, or you can ask very few of them. You can create a survey for if you have a fictional city, you can do an overview of people, and then again focus on your main characters. Or you can just do your main characters if you want. It's also helpful to do the villains. But here are example questions that you can ask that come from the 4 fields of anthropology. The first one that I want to mention is coming of age. This is what I did my thesis on, so it's something I'm really interested in. And the question is, what was it like when your character became an adult? Or what will they do when they become an adult? So throughout history, the passage from childhood to adulthood is huge socially, really important, and this is something that's especially important in YA books, because your characters will be going through this transition probably while the readers are reading about the book. There's an example of Arya Stark. There was a bit of controversy over the sex scene that she had in the show Game of Thrones. People said, you know, she didn't seem like an adult to them because they'd witnessed her upbringing and that sort of thing. And the writers of Game of Thrones fired back that, well, she was over 18, the actor was over 18, the character was over 18, so it's fine, right? But I don't necessarily think it was so fair to dismiss that. I think the problem was we never saw Arya move from childhood to adulthood in a satisfactory way. So to us, the reader, she was still really a child. And nobility are famous, even during war, because I'm sure there's some people who are saying, well, it was the middle of a war, what do you want them to do, have a big Chuck E. Cheese party for her? Well, even in the midst of war, nobility are famous for making a huge deal out of the transition from childhood to adulthood. So we should have really seen a scene where Arya had to sign tons of paperwork explaining that she was taking on new roles in Winterfell when she finally did reach Winterfell. And had we seen that kind of thing, it would have helped us understand that she was an adult. If there really was no transition for a person, that really does say something too, because historically transitions are huge, and even today graduation is a massive event in people's lives, and the movement from high school to college, or the movement from high school to the workforce, is a really momentous occasion. Then there's also how we think about death, and not just the spiritual side of this, but what will happen to your character's body after they die. So in certain cultures, I was actually just reading about Zoroastrianism, in which folks used to be eaten by birds. Apparently now there are issues where there are so few natural carrion that practice just doesn't function anymore. But in a fantasy setting, it can surely still function, and it really is a pretty traditional way of burying folks that we don't really think of so much today, or disposing of a body, right? Not burial, right? This can be a huge issue for your characters if they don't feel like they're going to be disposed of correctly, right? If they're or if they're in a foreign land and they're risking death, it can be scary for someone who is very religious to think that their body might not be disposed of properly. Body disposal also matches the terrain. So in New Orleans, for example, there are the famous mausoleums. They look pretty, but they're also to solve a very real problem with the ground being too spongy, that burials sometimes resurface. I don't know if that's still true, because concrete burials are pretty permanent. It might just be cultural at this point, but they did originally have a reason. So when you're considering your disposal system, think a little bit about the landscape of your world. Also, one thing that I find very interesting is that people in the past used to modify bodies after death to prevent things like a zombie or a vampire, or that sort of thing. So there are examples of bodies, again, after they were dead. This wasn't something that happened before they were dead, while they were still alive, but after they were dead, sometimes the jaws would be smashed with a brick to prevent them from rising up and coming back from the dead. And if your characters know that this is a trend in their world, and they come across a cemetery and there's a body that is mysteriously out of its tomb, and it has a fully intact jaw, that's pretty big foreshadowing for some vampire or zombie antics, and it is something that can be used, again, a cultural element that can be used to advance the narrative. Sociolinguistics is also a good way of building a fantasy world. What we want to think about here is what the way your character talks tells other people about their place and social class of origin. I know some people don't think they have an accent. Everyone has an accent. Every language is spoken with differing accents, and everyone has them. It's impossible to not have an accent. Accents and dialects mark your speech with clues to your place of origin, and thinking about them is useful for you as a writer. I am not saying write with a Scottish brogue or something like that. Please don't do that. It's very painful. Rather than imagining how the fictional accent actually sounds, what's better is to consider the social implications of that language. So when someone meets your character for the first time, how noticeable is their accent? I mean, is it incredibly obvious that they're a noble person, or that they're a farm worker, or have they done something to try to hide their accent? I know my accent is a little bit strange because I was born in Pennsylvania, but I lived a long time in Texas, and now I've lived for many years in Mexico. So my accent is just all over the place. Even still, people sometimes still peg me as being from Pennsylvania. So this is something that you can think about for your character. This is especially useful in stories where the main character is an outsider to the area that they're at. Then we can think about the biological anthropology of diet. This is really one of my favorite questions, and a lot of writers love writing about food. So when we think about the biological anthropology of diet, what we want to think of is, what is your character's ideal meal? And I don't just mean the food itself, but the whole meal experience, right? In real life, we can use chemicals like strontium analysis to see, to show dietary change over a person's lifetime. We can use their teeth to see if they were local to the region where they were buried, if not where they were from. We can tell if they ate well or poorly. We can tell if they ate a lot of fish or whatever. We can tell if they went through a caterpillar eating phase, and that's actually a real life example. So these are things that we can tell from a person's teeth. What does your character's diet say about them? It's probably going to change over the arc of your story. I imagine that your character is going to go through some changes, maybe going from rich to poor or poor to rich, maybe from going from one part of the world to another. They might eat less than normal, they might eat differently, they might get stuck in a caterpillar eating phase, and that kind of thing is really important for showing not just your character's reactions to the diet, but what the diet in different parts of your world looks like, creating a much richer story, right? And I absolutely love this picture here of the Hobbit meals. You see the breakfast, second breakfast, elevensies, and everything that is sprawled out on the table. But we really don't know a whole lot. I'm sure there are some people who do, but we really don't know a whole lot about what other cultures in Middle-earth eat. And those questions are, they don't necessarily have to happen if your story is about a hobbit, which is why we don't really get that information. But if your story was about an elf or a human or that sort of thing, it would be much more important to know what their diets are like. This is a good place to avoid jelly bean problems, because if you're in a swamp and everyone eats beef, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because it's hard to keep cows in a swamp. So you need to ask yourself where they get that food from. Well, you don't need to ask yourself these questions, right? But asking these questions will help your story get fleshed out a lot, because as soon as you say, where did a certain item of food come from, you are also developing the socio-political relationships of your world, because presumably if they live in a swamp, they're importing their beef. Another aspect of biological anthropology is variation. So the question that you can ask here is about how your character's environment has influenced their development. And a lot of times when we think about the variation of humans, we automatically go to skin color. That's an interesting topic, but it's not the only topic that you can explore when it comes to variation. Bodies are really modified a lot by the climate, and by the climate that a person's ancestors has grown up in. So for example, does your half-naked barbarian spend his days running in the snow, right? If he does, I really hope he's got some decent fat pads in his cheeks, because otherwise he's going to get a lot of hypothermia. And you can see here, this is a famous Frank Frazetta painting of a guy who is riding some polar bears. Love it so much. On the other hand, he's going to be very cold. So elevation and humidity, these over time actually do affect the average height and chest shape of the people who live in an area. So is a thin character from the top of a mountain, or are there giants on a small island? You can say yes to any of these questions without ruining your world, but then going on to ask, well, why? I mean, it's a fantasy world, anything can happen, but why are there giants on an island? Typically the people who live on, or the species that live on an island grow smaller, not bigger, right? If you answer the question of why there are giants on this island, you will be doing some very interesting and important world building that helps your story flourish. You don't have to abandon plots because they're unreal, but explaining why can introduce really important depth to your world. I also have to talk about archaeology because I studied archaeology. This question is specifically a reference to Buffy, I'm not going to lie. You see this little comment up here, right? There were attempts to open the Hellmouth by the Master in 1997, the Sisterhood of Jay in 1999, sorry, I don't remember how to pronounce these things. Sacrifice of 3, performed by 3 Valral demons in 2000, was effectively opened by the first evil in 2002, Lisa in 2003, then by Buffy, Faith, and a group of potential slayers again in 2003, right? What about before the 90s, right? We have this really a big empty past. So the way that we can solve that is by asking, who is one hero from the ancient past my character looks up to, and what mark did they actually leave on their world, right? Not just, oh, there were slayers before, but what did the slayers do? What sorts of apocalypses did they stop, right? Now I know that that particular question got expanded on a little bit in the comic books and all the ancillary mediary and that sort of thing, but let's pretend that you're not going to have 400 issues of a comic book series to back up your storyline, right? When you're doing this, you don't need 10,000 years of history. I know the allure of creating that sort of thing for a fictional world, but if you do create it, you need to make sure that what is actually revealed to your readers is information that is perceived by your main character. It's information that is important to your main character. If it's information that is very far out of the realm of importance to the way that your main character lives their life, it's probably not really worth putting into the story. Character-focused past. So that's why the question is, what heroes from the past do your character look up to specifically? We're not just talking about any heroes from the past, we're talking about the ones that your character cares about and why they care about them, what resonates with them. And again, this forces you to consider the impact of people who may have performed deeds as epic as the one your hero will performed. It explains why the Hellmouth was relatively quiet for so long. When you're working on this sort of thing, I mentioned before that Ursula Lin did not copy-paste with her work, and I highly recommend that you don't copy-paste either. You can be inspired by real-world cultures and traits from real-world cultures, especially if it's a culture you come from, but you really run the risk of stereotype if you don't ask why things are how they are. I'm sure you've noticed that I've been saying why a lot in this presentation, and again, you can make up whatever answer you want, but you do need to think about why certain things are the way they are. And if it's also important to think why we think certain things about ancient cultures, or really any other cultures. So in Warhammer, the Lizardmen are very clearly Mesoamerican stereotypes. They are not Mesoamerican, they are a hot mess of Mesoamerican stereotypes, and not just stereotypes, but stereotypes created by the people who were out to eliminate them from the face of the earth. So the stereotypes that are being utilized are really, really, really negative ones. I know that some writers will say, I should be able to write whatever I want, and I agree with that to some extent. On the other hand, it's not that you feel edgy if you create a stereotype in your work, it's that it feels stupid, because stereotypes are flat. They're not tropes, they're flatter than tropes, and they are embarrassing when a writer really leans into them. It's not just that you're saying something controversial or edgy, it's that you're saying something that is, well, stupid. So that's why I say, do your research and start from your characters. If as you're building your characters, they start to look like members of a real world culture, that's great, and feel free to lean into that if you come to it naturally. On the other hand, you need to do a lot more work if you're starting out from the point of, my rock trolls are Korean. So that's a lot of information that I've just given you all. So when we talk about using all this information in our work, we can use it both in the writing and in the planning phase. So obviously we'll start with the planning phase. This is where you would do the ethnography that I mentioned before, the ethnography of our heroes. You'd pick, again, most importantly, the main character, but also other characters as well if you want to. And you ask them questions about what their lives are like and what their daily routines are, and that will help you start to see patterns of ritual behavior in other people in your world. If everybody, or if your main character does something, you kind of want to ask, well, does everyone else from his or her town of origin do the same thing? Or are they very unique in their behaviors? And if they're very unique, what do people think about that, right? We're building outward using logic. We're not using copy-paste. Again, your first questions, you want to say things like, well, my character is an outsider. How do people perceive outsiders? That's a cultural anthropology question. Or my character is oppressed by the evil empire. How does the empire manifest oppression? This can be both a cultural and a biological anthropology question. And again, once you start answering these questions, you'll push out even more with more questions. If every question ends in why, you'll get really far with building your fictional culture, but the start will have always been your character. You do want to think, one thing I haven't really talked about too much in this presentation just because it is a little short, right, is that you do want to think about a dynamic relationship with the environment. Many variations in real world cultures are the results of the environment. This is another reason those Mesoamerican lizard men look so silly, because they come from this very swampy area where you really couldn't even build pyramids in the first place because they would sink into the swamp. Again, these kinds of variations do affect culture. Of course, after years of trading with their neighbors, they might choose to build pyramids in the swamp anyway, but then you know that the answer to that question of why they're doing this certain behavior is because of trade with their neighbors, and now you have a launching point for more dynamic interactions with their neighbors. Not only will this create a developed world, but it will give you inspiration for how your character interacts in that world. You can also use this information that you've created when you're directly in the writing process. For example, white rooms, which are it's a slang term for situations where there's basically walls of dialogue that look sort of like a play. White rooms are something that you can deal with by adding cultural details to interactions, hand gestures and that sort of thing. There are a lot of different things that we do, behaviors that we have that are cultural that we might not think of. Things like firm handshakes being the norm. Handshakes at all being the norm. I know that in my works there are a group of creatures that do not like to be touched at all, so they've developed sort of the COVID fist bump. And as silly as it kind of seems to outsiders, they take that behavior very seriously. So you can imagine that when they're interacting with each other, those are all elements about them that I can add to white room situations. For example, if a human tries to put their hand on their shoulder, I know that my Aordes people will definitely take a big step back. It also ironically helps to avoid info dumps, though, because when we're describing our world, we're going to be thinking about what is important to the character and why, because that's what our ethnography focused on. Ethnography was used to build a profile of the culture from an individual perspective. Culture can also be the source of minor conflict. If you know that two characters need to get in an argument about something, but it's a minor point in the storyline and you can't figure out exactly what their argument really needs to be over, or an argument that's already happening needs to get escalated, you can throw in some cultural details that drive the conflict, right? It can also help to detail background characters, same way that I mentioned with the argument idea. I know that I had a character who I wanted to have been close to the prince, but now she's very poor, but she still has a relationship with the prince, so why does she have this relationship? I started to think about what their situation might have been. Well, the prince lives very high on a cliff face, and all the poor people live very at the bottom of this cliff face. So I thought, well, at one point she must have fallen, she hurt her leg, and she was sort of outcast from the royal area because she couldn't climb up the steps anymore. It sucks. It shows that there's some injustice in the land. And it also explains why she lives at the bottom with the poor folks, because she can't get all the way up to the top. On the other hand, it explains how the prince knows her, because she wasn't down at the bottom before. And this is a cultural situation, because the only reason she needs to live at the bottom, or the only reason she's associated with poverty now that she lives at the bottom of a cliff, is because of the culture that surrounds that world. So again, it added a lot of detail that wouldn't have otherwise been there. Finally, when you reach jelly bean problems, if you do reach jelly bean problems, the jelly bean problem, the main problem was acquisition. If you're finding a situation where you're not sure where a MacGuffin came from, or you need something to be dropped in very conveniently, you can start to think of a cultural solution to that problem, right? It was at a festival. That's the best explanation for anything. So just to summarize some of the things that I said today, anthropology is the study of people. So when you think of it that way, we're not really looking at the society. We're looking at the characters, and we're looking at how they perceive their society. So it's character first world building. If you're doing something in anthropology, if you're using the anthropological method in your work, you're going to be asking questions of the characters, and you're going to let them develop as you feel they would naturally develop for the story. That means no copy pasting. Again, if you do it, it's not the end of the world, but I really try to avoid saying this is a Greek-inspired fantasy, or this is a a Mesoamerican-inspired fantasy, or this is a Babylonian-inspired fantasy. And the reason that I try to avoid doing that is because, again, if you start from your characters, you'll be able to flesh out cultures that are both original and not stereotypical. When you're doing this, you want to take from all four fields. Again, we have our culture, we have our language, we have our bodies, and then we also have our past, right? And so cultural, linguistic, biological, and anthropology and anthropological. And those are all things that you can ask of your characters. You can ask their opinions on those things, right? Start with character ethnographies. If you combine that with thoughts about where they are and their environment and how people in that specific area might solve problems, this is when you can really get into that whole, they're Greek-inspired or Arabic-inspired or that sort of thing, because you can say, well, I know now my character lives in the desert. How do people typically solve problems in the desert? And you'll see that there are some similarities across cultures. So you might end up with a culture that you thought was Arabic-inspired, but is really inspired by a large number of cultures. And again, that culture then feels a lot more rich and detailed. And what you have there is a fantastic culture. So thank you very much, and have a great day, and feel free to give me any questions that you have.